Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. One might think that museums are new in the Gulf region. The fact is that these cultural institutions came to existence in the Gulf as early as 1957, as it was in Kuwait. However, since the end of the Second Gulf War, attitude toward museum has changed dramatically, especially with the plundering and burning of the Kuwait National Museum during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Tonight, Dr. Alexander Kazironi will explore this new attitude and go beyond the prevailing approach that reduces museums in this part of the world to mere tools for economic diversification of oil-producing countries. Dr. Alexander Kazironi is a political science teacher at the Sciences Po Paris and specializes in the Middle East studies and cultural organization and public policies. His thesis on museums in the Gulf was based in part on field research in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Dr. Kazironi has also researched the renewal of Islamic art departments in the West and the new regional contemporary art market in Dubai. Now, as the rule of the House, when we start, please, from now, be sure that your mobile phones are turned off. And usually we don't allow flash photography. Now, let's welcome Dr. Kazironi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khaja, for this introduction. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you for all of you for your presence here this evening. I want to thank first and foremost Sheikha Houssa El-Sabah for having invited me and Dar El-Asar and all the team, the people working in her team. I would like also to thank the National Council and the Al-Qurain Festival. I've understood that this lecture is the first one from Dar El-Asar, part of the Al-Qurain Festival. So it's a great honor for me. I know the importance also of this festival in Kuwaiti cultural life, a cultural life that is very rich, very old. Kuwait is the birthplace for modern cultural policies in the Gulf region, and it's a great pleasure for me to share with you some of the results of this 6 years long research on museums in the Gulf countries. So, why this research and why this object is important and was important for me? The main object of my research, and the main one that I will deal with you this evening, is a new type of museums that has appeared in the Gulf region during the last 20 years. And to be more accurate, at the beginning of the 90s. With the projects of the Museum of Islamic Art of Qatar. Qatar is the birthplace for not only the new relation to media, the new relation to universities, the new relation to sports, but also the new regional relation to museums. Even if Abu Dhabi is now attracting more press, more attention in the international media, with its Louvre Abu Dhabi project or the Guggenheim project, the beginning of the current trends that Abu Dhabi is part of now is Qatar. And Qatar, in the aftermath of the Second Gulf War, the 1990-1991 Gulf War, the one that saw Iraq invading Kuwait and then an international coalition led by the United States liberating this country. So this new relation with museums in the region is characterized by the international visibility that the museums are intended to bring for the Gulf region. That's the reason why I have decided to call the new museums in the Gulf region the visibility museums, as opposed to the former group of museums that existed in this era that I have called, following the cultural actors in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, and in the UAE, the heritage museums, or متاحف التراث. I've just translated into English and into French. And maybe to be more accurate, it's better to say Turath museums, because it's different. At a regional scale, we have had in this area a model of ethnographic and archaeologic museum that is different from what we can see in the rest of the world, because archaeologic and ethnographic museums are not proper to the Gulf region, of course. So those visibility museums, one can see them nowadays in 2 Emirates, and only in 2 Emirates, in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi. The most famous visibility museum nowadays is for sure the Louvre Abu Dhabi. So this project was announced in 2006. The agreement was signed in 2007 between the French government and the UAE government, and maybe to be more accurate, between the French government and the local government of Abu Dhabi. So you can see here the model for this museum. It's now due to open in 2015, but nothing is definitely sure. And it has been designed by Jean Nouvel, the French famous architect Jean Nouvel. This visibility museum is part of a bigger so-called cultural district located in an island nearby the island of Abu Dhabi. And this island bears the name of Saadiyat Island. So on this huge island, you have only a section devoted to culture through museums, through 4 museums and a performing arts center. Here you see the performing arts center, designed by Zaha Hadid, the British-Iraqi famous architect. Here you have the Louvre Abu Dhabi by Jean Nouvel. Here, the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, designed by Frank Gehry, the Canadian-American architect. And here, the Maritime Museum, designed by the Japanese architect Tadao Ando. This is the first model for the cultural district. Now you have here on a hill the Sheikh Zayed National Museum, designed by Sir Norman Foster, not represented here. And the Maritime Museum has been moved to this section of the island here. Here you have images of those 4 museums. So the Performing Arts Center is not a museum. The Louvre Abu Dhabi, the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, Zayed National Museum, and here the Maritime Museums. The Louvre Abu Dhabi should open in 2015, the Guggenheim in 2020 maybe, and the Zayed National Museum in 2016. Concerning the Maritime Museum, the project has not advanced at all since the announcement of the cultural district in 2006. And according to the cultural actors in Abu Dhabi, probably this museum will never be created. So this project has been abandoned, and the Performing Arts Center also. Nothing is sure, but the cultural actors there, including those who work for the organization developing the island, don't believe that this museum and the Performing Arts Center will ever open their doors. The other important visibility museums are in Qatar, and the only one that has till now opened its door is there. And it's the Museum of Islamic Art, designed by Yeo Ming Pei. The project was launched, just after the invasion of Kuwait, and Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, the former ruler who abdicated very recently in 2013, in June, had the idea himself. The idea to create in Qatar a museum devoted to Islamic art with a high level of international visibility was not given to him by a foreign consultant or by any of his advisors. it was really his idea as a crown prince. And he got it before the coup in 1995. He announced it to his family in nearby 1992. And he says that he got the idea when seeing the Kuwait National Museum burning. And he got the idea to create a new space for exhibiting Islamic art in the region. In 1996, he announced officially that there will be an Islamic art museum in Qatar, and he chose Sheikh Saud bin Mohammed Al Thani, one of his cousins, as the person responsible for the project. And why in 1996? Because that year they opened in Qatar the Orientalist Museum. And when Sheikh Hamad visited the museum, he was disappointed by the scale of the building, and he then decided officially to launch the project for a bigger museum in his emirate. And in 1998, they changed the architect for the project from Mr. Badran, the Jordanian architect, to replace him by Yeo Ming Pei, so I.M. Pei, the architect of the pyramid of the Louvre in Paris. And the museum was opened in 2008. So this project is very important because it has all the characteristics of this new relation to museums in the Gulf region. Some of those characteristics could have already existed in some museums. For example, asking a Western architect to create a huge building was the case of the Kuwait National Museum. The Kuwait National Museum has been designed by Michel Ecochard. Michel Ecochard is not as famous as I.M. Pei, but if you go to the Centre Pompidou to see the new permanent exhibition, there is a section of the museum devoted to Michel Ecochard now, because his importance is being reassessed. And the museum in Kuwait is one of his latest and one of his most important projects. Other visibility museums in Qatar, the one which has not been opened is the Qatar National Museum. It's designed by Jean Nouvel. The model was presented in 2010, and for the moment we still don't know when it will open its doors. So this new museum is built around an old palace, Sheikh Abdullah Al Thani's palace, built in the beginning of the 20th century. And around this building, you had already a national museum built in the mid-70s. It opened in 1975, but in the mid-20s, they decided to destroy it and to create a new building around the palace so that it can bring to Qatar more visibility at an international scale. So how should we try to understand those new projects? I propose you two approaches, a historical approach and a comparative approach. If one gives a historical depth to those new projects, one can understand much better what are their goals and what is their new political meaning. Because my approach consists in trying to see beyond the narrative of the diversification of the economy thanks to museums. Because this is a part, not only a narrative, but a marketing storytelling. The official storytelling associated to those new museums consists in explaining that those projects are launched to diversify the economy in the perspective of the end of the oil era. But when one looks at the countries that are developing them, they are the places where oil dominates the economy and will dominate the economy in the next decade. And nothing is made in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi to really develop tourism in those places. We already have two touristic destinations along the coast. It's Bahrain and Dubai. And when one looks at the the way this tourism has expanded and the reasons for its success, they are very clear. Bahrain and Dubai have targeted the regional audience. Their tourism sector is expanding because of tourists coming from India, coming from Saudi Arabia, coming from Pakistan, coming from Iran. But in Abu Dhabi and in Qatar, they are not at all looking in those directions. Museums are not a new institution in the Gulf region. The Louvre Abu Dhabi, maybe those of you who have read the international press when the project was announced, know that it was named in France Le Louvre des Sables, of Al-Louvre fi wasat al-Rimal, or the Louvre in the sands. This phrase reflected the Western perception of this region, and this perception consisted in seeing the Gulf region as a desert, a cultural desert, particularly concerning museums. But when I started my research, I came to the region, I saw that we already have approximately 100 museums in the Arabian Peninsula. The majority of them are along the coast, are in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in the UAE, and in Qatar. So, of course, in this region, the history of museum is not as old as it is in other Arab countries, in Europe, but we already have a history that dates back to the 50s. The first museum in the Arabian Peninsula is the Aden Museum. It opened in 1931. This decision was taken by the British governor of Aden. It had no consequence on the rest of the peninsula. It triggered no dynamics for creating new museums. So it's really an isolated case, the Aden Museum. But the start for creating museums took place in Kuwait in 1957. In 1957, the first national museum opened in Kuwait in the former palace of Sheikh Ghazal, the former emir of Muhammara in the south of Iran. So this emir of the Bani Ka'ab had built a palace in Kuwait City. And in 1957, it was transformed by Sheikh Abdallah Sheikh Abdallah al-Salem al-Jaber, who was the head of the Education Council. He transformed it into a museum. And after that, another museum opened on Failaka Island in the 60s. And then the Education Museum that still exists and is still open in Kuwait City in the 70s. But again, this is not the start of the creation of a regional model. To find the very moment when the Heritage Model Museum was created in the Gulf region, one has to look at Bahrain. Sorry. To look at Bahrain at the beginning of the 70s. In 1970, the Emir of Bahrain, Sheikh Isa al-Khalifa, took the decision to create a national museum at the occasion of the organization of one of the first important international gathering in the Gulf region. It was the International Conference for Asian Archaeologists. And because Bahrain was the place for rediscovering the Dilmun civilization, the Danish archaeologists who made those important discoveries managed to get from the International Organization of Archaeologists that this conference, to have this conference in Manama. And at this occasion, they convinced the emir to open a museum for the foreign guests. They invited also a British specialist of communication and marketing, and not an archaeologist, to shape the content of the museum. And this gentleman, who is still alive, his name is Michael Rice, is later created at the beginning of the 80s, the Association of the British Specialists of Communication and Marketing. So what was now the content of those new heritage museums? To let you know more about them, I propose you some pictures of exemplary heritage museums. Here you have pictures of the Al Ain Museum, opened first in 1969 in this former fort of the Al Nahyan ruling family of Abu Dhabi. The museum first opened in 1969. It was a decision of Sheikh Zayed in Al Ain city. And in 1971, it was opened again at the occasion of the independence, to celebrate the independence of the UAE. And at that time, they added this modern building. So here you see what is typical of the Heritage Museum, is the use and the restoration of old buildings, be they palaces or forts belonging to the ruling family. The content of those heritage museums that one can find all over the Gulf is very clearly defined. You have, on the one hand, an archaeology section. You see the one at the Al Ain Museum. So it looks like many museums all over the world. You had shelves, you had results of archaeological digging. And the other section of the museum, important section of the museum, is devoted to ethnography. And generally, you have life-size dummies representing women and men with their traditional dresses. Here you have another typical heritage museum, the Dubai Museum. It opened in 1971. It is located in Al Fahidi Fort, so along the creek of Dubai. And this fort was restored so that it could house in its wings the first Dubai Museum. And then in the 80s, they created an extension that is underground and is covered by this platform. So what were the goals of those museums displaying archaeology, ethnography in an old restored building? First aim, legitimization of the leadership. Here you see the entrance of the Al Ain Museum. You have portraits of Sheikh Zayed, the Crown Prince, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, and the current Emir of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed. You have family trees here. And above the entrance door, you have sayings of Sheikh Zayed concerning heritage and culture. The other important aim of this heritage museum is the legitimization of the logo of an invented tradition. Invented tradition is a common phrase now used to talk about museums all over the world, be they in Europe, in America, or in the rest of the world. And the logos is a term framed by Benedict Anderson, the politist, to talk about the symbolic element chosen by a state among a large repertoire to represent the national identity. I have just taken two examples of logo that are put and exhibited in those heritage museums and that are, through that process, legitimized. So you have here the famous traditional Bedouin coffee pot, Al-Dalla. So you have it in this museum in Dubai. This is the Sheikh Said house in Dubai, and which is also the Museum for Historic Documents, it's his name. And here you have a Dalla in a roundabout. So the object that is used outside of the museum is legitimized inside the museum by being exhibited in a scientific context. So this is a very common process that you find all over the world. And the other logo is the Wind Tower. Here you have the logo of the Dubai municipality with wind towers, Al-Barjil. And here inside the Dubai Museum, you have a section devoted to traditional architecture and particularly the story of the wind towers. Another important political aim of this heritage museum is to unify the national community. When looked at from outside, from Europe particularly, the Gulf countries are seen as places where you have mainly two groups, the nationals as a bloc, culturally unified, and the foreigners, the immigrants, who represent the majority of the population. But, and when one looks at the new projects, one can see that the main preoccupation for those in charge of developing the new project is the place of the immigrant in the Gulf countries, the foreigner. Because it's an important issue in the West, in Europe, where the immigrants should or could become citizens in the near future. But inside the heritage museums in the Gulf, one can clearly see that this is not the important political fault line. The important political fault line is the division inside the national community. And that's what makes really the heritage museum fascinating and politically very interesting. Those heritage museums show unified populations through their clothes, for example. Here you have dummies in the Dubai Museum from different sections of the museum. Here you have the ladies and the men. Here you have the lady inside a house in the city section. Here a lady in the oasis section. Here a lady in the desert life section, so a Bedouin lady. And here a lady in the maritime section. And here you have the corresponding men. You can see that there is the dress that they are wearing in those heritage museums are approximately the same. And those museums pretend to represent the reality of life in the Gulf countries in the 50s. But through pictures, we know that in the 50s and in the 60s, the way people clothes was different depending on their location. The people in the desert did not wear the same clothes as the ones in the ports. And, but here you see that in the Heritage Museum in Dubai, those differences are not represented at all, because the objective is to represent the national community as a bloc. So, unifying the national population, but at the same time, creating a social hierarchy, valorizing the Bedouin. Here you have the representation of a Bedouin couple inside the Dubai Museum. And you don't have anything, you have nothing similar for the other sections of the museum. In the maritime section, you don't have a representation of the Bahri people, the people from the sea, or the same for the city dwellers. Another characteristic, important characteristic of this heritage museum is that they avoid history. Those museums never deal with the regional history, and unless the local history. There is nothing about tribal wars, nothing about colonization, and nothing about the neighboring countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Iran. But you will have information about the relation between the Gulf countries and Greece in the ancient times, the relations between the Gulf countries and India till the 20th century, but nothing about those three countries. Why? Because those are the places where an important part of the national population is coming from. So those museums are avoiding all that deals with internal issues. I mean, political issues inside the national community. They can talk very easily about the relations with India. Why? Because all over the Gulf, if you look at the national population, the number of people who got the nationality and are from India is very small compared to those who are from Saudi Arabia, of course, Yemen, but also Iran and Africa. Instead of talking about history, instead of proposing chronologies, instead of distinguishing inside the national community between cultural or ethnic groups, depending on the places of origin of the population, you have a climatic, an environmental division. So this environmental division is part of the process of avoiding history, the local history. So generally, and those examples are also from the Dubai Museum, but you find this realm all over the Gulf. You have generally, for the ethnographic section, a subdivision devoted to the desert. So al-Thaqafa al-Sahrawiya, the culture of the desert. Another big section devoted to the culture of the maritime culture, al-Thaqafa al-Bahriya. And then, more rarely, but you have it in Bahrain, you have it also in the UAE, and also in Kuwait at the Heritage Museum, a section devoted to city life, the people living in the cities, the city dwellers, those that are called in the Gulf al-Hadar. But you see, nowhere they will tell you about ethnicity or history. History of immigration, of waves that have entered the national community. But all that I have said till now is, could be compared to what you have all over the world. Museums are not a place where you have, in the process of nation building, the state defines national identity and imposes it to the population. You had it in Europe in the 19th century, and you have it in all the developing countries after the end of the colonization, the 60s, 70s. But what really makes the heritage museums in the Gulf region interesting is that. And I understood it 1 year after starting my research, when I started doing interviews with the directors of those museums, and I started to really spend time with the cultural bureaucrats managing all those museums in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in the UAE, and in Qatar. Nowhere in those museums you will read the word Iran or the word, very rarely the word Africa. Nowhere. But when you look at the dioramas, diorama, I don't know how to pronounce it well in English, but the diorama in a museum, in an ethnographic museum, is a place where you represent the population through dummies with local dress, and they are in sense where they practice a traditional activity. And when you look at the dummies, in the wax dummies at the Dubai Museum, you clearly see that the three groups composing the national community are represented by the cultural bureaucrats. And when I did the interviews in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and in the UAE, I understand that the cultural bureaucrats really wanted it and want to have inside the museum the representation not only of the Asil people. Asil in Arabic means authentic, noble, pure. So the people who have a tribal affiliation and have roots that brings them back to the core of the Arabian Peninsula. So here you have typical Bedouin gentlemen. But they also wanted to represent the people from the eastern part of Africa who came to this region through slavery. And also, and that was more difficult for me to distinguish, the people from the south of Iran. And when doing an interview in one of the Gulf Heritage Museum, the director of the museum told me, have you noticed that the baker in the heritage section has a Persian face? I asked him, oh, no. He told me, go back and look at his face. He has a Persian face. And then, for example, when I did a lot of interviews in Sharjah, Sharjah is a very important place for everything dealing with heritage, they always told me that people in the Gulf recognize each other, know each other's origin, but they never name, they don't want to express it explicitly in the cultural places. But why the cultural bureaucrats wanted it in the museums? Because when the Heritage Museum were first created in the 70s, they were developed with British experts. And the British experts really created museum only valorizing the Bedouins. So the Arabic roots. But to create those museums, the new states needed a cultural bureaucracy. So they hired a lot of people and they trained a lot of people who actually were not from the core of the center of the Arabian Peninsula, but a lot of them were people of African or Iranian descent. So when one look at the composition of the culture, the sociology of the cultural bureaucracy all over the Gulf, one can see that the number of people of African origin or of coming from the south of Iran, some of them are Arabs, others are Persian. It's not mean that those who are from the south of Iran are all Persian. No, a lot of them are actually from Arab families there. But they wanted to show that they are part of the national community. So the Heritage Museum became in the 80s, because it's in the 80s that all those heritage museums were changed by the national bureaucracy, by introducing inside of them representations of what people call here sometimes African people, people of African origin or generally, and people from the south of Iran, from what is called here Sahel Faris generally. And they introduced those representation, but without writing it in in any way inside the museum. So it's a place where something very strong is shown, is displayed through images, but not told explicitly. Here you have a very important scene, and I had confirmation when doing interviews. This picture is from Kuwait National Museum, the heritage section. You have the decoration for a wedding, so it's a nuptial room. So after the wedding, you have the bride, her husband, and if you look at them, you clearly see that the cultural bureaucrats wanted to represent inter-ethnic wedding, which is not, and you can find all over the Gulf such wedding, but you clearly notice that it's a limit to the unity of the national population, the issue of intermarriage between different components of the national communities. And here another very meaningful diorama representing explicitly black people with a white man in the same place, to show that the national population is made of people of different origins that live together. And you know, that was not at all the discourse of this museum when they were created with British expertise in the 70s, not at all. If you have that, it's because this museum, those who took over the management of this museum were nationals. Nationals from the non-Ghair Asil groups. So you see the impact on a museum when you have nationals working inside of them, and how when nationals take part to the shaping of the content, the museum can really be related to the topics that are meaningful for a country. When you look at the scientific projects of the new museums, for example, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, they are very interesting, but they never deal with the issues that are meaningful for the Gulf countries. For example, in Qatar, they have decided to create a slavery museum. It has not been publicized yet, but in 2010, a journalist who came there from Financial Times heard of this project, and he wrote it in an article. The only place you can find a mention of this museum, that is under planning now. They have created a team, mainly of foreigners, to create this museum. But this museum has created a very bad reaction among the nationals of African origin all over the Gulf, because they also went to the UAE to discuss it with cultural bureaucrats there. And they were not receptive at all for such a project. and particularly those who have African origin. They don't want such a project. But when you look at what's happening in the Western museums, this is a very important issue in the West right now, to recognize the history of slavery, to represent the minority groups, to create a museum for the Jewish people, for the black people, to recognize the immigration history in France, for example. But here in the Gulf, this is not what the national want. What they wanted is to go as far as that, you know, showing that this national community has a unity, but inside of it, you have other people than only Asil people, people who have tribal affiliation. So here, I think you have clearly understood what are the features of what I call the Heritage Museum. Here I propose you a comparative comparison between the model of the Heritage Museum and those new museums that I call the Visibility Museum. Actually, there are two contradictory models. If you look at the building, the Heritage Museum is housed in a traditional architecture by an anonymous architect. The Visibility Museum is named after the architect who is in charge of it. Everybody will tell you about the Maritime Museum by Tadao Ando, or the Louvre Abu Dhabi by Jean Nouvel. The name, the association with a famous architect is crucial for those museums to provide them with international visibility. Concerning the collection, you have on the one hand collections of archaeology and ethnography, or folklore, collected or excavated locally with only a local symbolic value. When you look at the Visibility Museum, the objects that are exhibited, even Islamic art or Orientalist art, are first and foremost segments of art history that are first valued in the West by the Western museum, the Western cultural institutions, and by the Western art market. If you look at the narrative, that's the reason why I insisted on the content, on the way the different segments of the national population are represented. You see that in the Heritage Museum are dealing with internal political issues, so the social hierarchy based on Asala, on the lineage, on Nasab, what is called in the Gulf Al-Nasab. And the Visibility Museum, developed in Abu Dhabi and Qatar, their content deals with Western political issues. So it can be the issue of diversity, the issue of the dialogue of civilization between Islam and the West, and the issue of the democratization of culture. For example, in Abu Dhabi, they did at the Agence France Museum, the structure in Paris who is in charge of creating the museum, they did some studies on the audience, on the public. Because if you go, if you look at what are the researchers that are done in France on museums, the main topic is the audience, is the public. How to attract the poor social classes to the museum. Why? Because in the West, public institutions are funded through taxes. So to legitimate them, you need to open them to all of the population. But this is not such an important issue here in the Gulf, because the opening of an institution is not made in exchange of taxes. So the state does not need this type of legitimization. And when I talk about diversity, diversity now in North America or in Western Europe is first and foremost the diversity of the national community based on the most recent immigration waves. So mainly how to represent in Europe Islam in the museums. That's also the reason why you have had the renewal of so many departments of Islamic art in North America and in Western Europe. Because now one of the main challenges for Western museums is to represent this new Western religion that Islam is through immigration, because those people of Muslim background have become Western citizens. The targeted audiences, the Heritage Museum, for all those reasons, particularly the value of the collection and its meaning, because if you don't clearly explain the importance of having an asyl person beneath a person of African origin and the person coming from the south of Iran, it means that you are creating a narrative that can first and foremost be understood by the nationals. So the target of this Heritage Museum, the targeted audience is made of the nationals. When the targeted audience for the Visibility Museum is clearly made of the Westerners. And those museums are not global museums. They are not targeting at all China, India, or Brazil. They are clearly targeting the West. And to be more accurate, they are targeting Western Europe. In Abu Dhabi, they created a structure that exists nowhere else in the world. It is called the Office of the Brand of Abu Dhabi. It is, you have no comparable institution, and even from Singapore, they sent a delegation to Abu Dhabi in 2010 to see what this structure consists in, because even in Singapore, place that has been copied so much in the Gulf and in the rest of the world, they don't have such a structure. And at the Office of the Brand of the Abu Dhabi, OBAD, in 2010, and then they changed it. You could read all their strategy on their website during approximately 5 months. Then they changed it, they withdrew their strategic plan from the website. And in their website, they were clearly stating that their main targets were European tourists from France, from Germany, and from the UK for the new museums and the new cultural institutions, and not the nationals. Concerning the actors of those museums, you see that the management teams who are shaping the content are the nationals for the Heritage Museum and also Arab expats. Arab expatriates, but from Sudan, from Egypt, from Iraq, from Syria, actually the places of Arab nationalism. And if you look at the teams that are in charge of the visibility museums in Abu Dhabi, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, in Qatar, the people who have really power at the Qatar Museum Authority, the large majority of them are foreigners, are Westerners. And they are not necessarily well specialized. For example, in Qatar, in 2010, they had hired several ladies from the United States to be in charge of creating the content of the National Museum. When I did interviews with them, they had very few information about the local history. They were not anthropologists or ethnographers or archaeologists specialized in the Gulf area. And even one of the ladies was before working in the Wine Museum in California. And she was in charge of creating the content for the National Museum in Qatar. I said that not to laugh at it at all, but to tell you that those museums are really isolated from the national populations. And it's a deliberate choice. I met so many people cultural actors complaining in the UAE because they are not included in the projects. Archaeologists, cultural actors, people who know very well, for example, the heritage issues. But if you, concerning they are excluded even from the shaping of the content of the Zayed National Museum. Zayed National Museum in Abu Dhabi on Saadiyat Island, beneath the Guggenheim and the Louvre, is not a museum about classical Western art nor contemporary art. It will tell the story of Sheikh Zayed and relate it to the story of the UAE. The majority of the most important UAE historians, specialists of UAE heritage are excluded from the project, from shaping its content. And the content is made in London by the British Museum. And concerning the language, and I experienced it myself when doing my research, if you want to do interviews to understand what the Heritage Museum is about, you have to speak Arabic. People speak English. A lot of the cultural actors have been sent for training in the UK, more rarely to the United States. But the language people use with each other inside the administration of those museums is Arabic. In the Visibility Museum, a lot of people don't speak Arabic, even the nationals, because the majority of the people who take the decision are Westerners. But you also have a few nationals working with them. Generally, they are very, very young nationals, and it's their first professional experience. And they are generally ladies from the most important families in the UAE or in Abu Dhabi or in Qatar. They have studied in English or British or French schools, and they do not mastermind Arabic language. And it's difficult for them to translate a text from English to Arabic. So, and just emblematic example, the Dubai Museum, I took the majority of my examples from this case, and the most exemplary visibility museum is, the most famous is Louvre Abu Dhabi, but actually if the most representative visibility museum should be the Maritime Museum, the one designed by Tadaondo. Why? Because this museum will never be created. And what makes also the difference between the Heritage Museum as a model and the Visibility Museum as a model is that the Heritage Museum, they exist, you can visit them, they are open, and they are effective like that. And the Visibility Museum are effective, they play their political and their economic role as projects. Since it has opened its doors, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha doesn't have any important exhibitions devoted to Islamic art. So if you look at the mediatic visibility of the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, it reached its climax just before the opening. After the opening, it was as if this museum, as a visibility museum, died. And the Maritime Museum is, for example, is a very good example. Why? Because it takes part to the mediatic visibility of Abu Dhabi without existing. So the way you can also distinguish those two models is, on the one hand, you have a physical museum, and on the other, it's a virtual project. And it is effective, more effective as a virtual project. So the model of the visibility, the Heritage Museum, it's political. Now, if we try to understand why we have the rise of this new model, because this is the important question. In this region where we had this model, the Heritage Museum, prevailing till the 80s, why do we have, since the beginning of the 90s, a new relation to museums that I have tried to describe here? And why this new model only exists in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi, and not in Kuwait, not in Bahrain or the other Emirates in the UAE? To understand that, one has to look at other explanations than the economic one. So the narrative of the diversification of the economy. Because Dubai has successfully diversified its economy without creating such visibility museums. There is also a perspective for diversifying the economy in Kuwait, and Bahrain has also already diversified its economy. Bahrain has very few oil and gas resources left. So my main idea, my thesis, is that one has to look at political changes in the area that are reflected by this new relation to museums. The Second Gulf War actually is a very important turning point in the region that has been undervalued, underestimated because of 9/11. The rise of the new category of museum, the visibility museum, is too often associated to 9/11, but it's not the case. When one looks at their history, their birth time, they date back to the Second Gulf War. So why at that moment do we have a new category of museum reflecting a new regional political order? So after the liberation of Kuwait, and it started in Qatar, you had new cultural policies targeting Western audience, because the aim of those new policies were to diversify the networks of the ruling families in the West, in the countries that have proved that they are able to defend those countries, to diversify their networks beyond the traditional sectors of oil and gas, energy, and weapons, purchasing weapons, the defense industries. And in Qatar, they first offered the United States to create a military base, but then they brought to Qatar branches of American universities. They started thinking of creating international sport events that are not as much global as they are bringing Qatar into Western networks. And then also the projects of creating in Qatar museum projects that will make of Qatar the first client of the Western art market and a very important cultural actor on the Western cultural scene. So those programs aimed at inserting Gulf countries into Western networks that are not only those of oil companies and weapon companies, but to insert them into networks that shape public opinion in Western democracies, where public opinion play an important role in case of a war. And for that reason, Kuwait is, the invasion of Kuwait was a very important event, because just before the invasion, part of the collection of Islamic art of Dar el-Asar al-Islamiyya had been sent to Russia for an exhibition. And it was already planned that this collection would move to the United States for a touring exhibition. And when the Iraqi troops entered Kuwait, they plundered the museum, they brought the most important objects to Baghdad, and the decision was taken that the collection will be used as part of the communication policy of the Al-Sabah family in the West. And if you look at this interesting book, Art in Exile, that has been published by Dar el-Asar al-Islamiyya, you could see articles in the American press that are supportive of the liberation of Kuwait. Now, here you see images of the 80s, because I told you the 80s was an age where you have, it was the golden age of Turas, in a time where the GCC was bringing the Emirates close to Saudi Arabia. So you had a golden age of Turas, so a valorization of Bedouin culture, but also a shift from the concept of al-Turas al-Sha'bi to the concept of al-Turas al-Islami. So the Islamization of the notion, the concept of Turas. Because in the 70s, the concept, Turas is the word for heritage, the Arabic word for heritage. In the 70s, the word, the heritage museums mainly presented a non-religious folklore. But in the 80s, when you had this cultural dimension of the creation of the GCC, you had a period of cultural Islamization all over the Gulf. Why? Because the strategy of the ruling families all over the Gulf was to take the lead of the cultural Islamization so that it won't come from outside. And it was a sort of controlled cultural Islamization from Kuwait to the UAE. And you clearly see it in the shift inside in the Heritage Museum from the sole concept of Turas Sha'bi, so popular culture, popular heritage, to Islamic heritage. And if you look at the new architecture that developed in the 80s, it's during the 80s that instead of only having new buildings with, inspired by traditional Khaliji architecture, you had more and more buildings inspired by Islamic architecture. Here you have the American University in Sharjah. Here a former souk transformed into the Museum of Islamic Civilization in Sharjah. Here the Art Museum in Sharjah, this one inspired by the Khaliji traditional architecture. And this museum, this Sharjah Art Museum, is in front of this heritage area made of Americans' old houses. So here you have images of the plunder and then the burning of the Kuwait National Museum. So this is the hall where the Islamic art collection of the Al-Sabah collection was exhibited, and here an image of the same hall after 1991. So to recapitulate, to sum up what I have said, after 1991, you have a new exchange, a new cultural realm with a new cultural exchange. And the most important point are the fact that through culture, you have an attempt to diversify the networks of the leaderships of those different emirates in the West, and not only networks thanks to the oil economy and the purchase of military weapons. And why? To shape the public opinions in the Western democracies so that you can also influence them when it is necessary to take the decision to come to this region to protect a ruling family or a state, certain state. And the other important element to have in mind is that nowadays the Gulf states have a new resource to rent, and not only oil and gas. Because Islam has now sedentarized, and this is a very important issue. Now Islam, it has become a Western religion, particularly in Europe, and a Western very important preoccupation for European states. And they are in demand of ways to legitimize their points of views over Islam. For example, in France, a very important problem for the French civil servants is how can they talk legitimately about Islam? The French state is not training clerks, ulama in France. So they can't do what is possible in Egypt, in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, and in many Islamic countries. They can't ask to an official mosque to convey the state's voice over Islam, the state's discourse over Islam. But what they can do is to talk about the history of Islam. And this is why the Islamic art departments have become so important in Western cultural scenes, because they are one of the rare places where the French state, the British state can say something legitimately about Islam, what Islam should be. Islam as a religion that is part of the national communities there now. And what the Gulf states, Qatar and Abu Dhabi, are now providing the Western states with is pieces of land inside the Muslim world where they can create museums displaying their own discourses. And Qatar and Abu Dhabi should be seen as places mirroring Western point of view over Islam nowadays, and by the way, legitimating it. But the issue of Islam in the West as the main preoccupation. So that's why I have entitled this presentation Mirrors of a New Order, because the most meaningful object to sum up what those new visibility museums are is a mirror, is the figure of a mirror actually. Qatar and Abu Dhabi are today offering a mirror to France, to the UK, to Germany, to legitimize their own discourse over the Islamic world and the Arab world, but for their internal political issues, and not so much to reshape the Muslim world. And this is a resource for the states, because in exchange of that, and not only in exchange of oil and money, they can obtain the protection of Western leadership. So here you have a map that I have tried to show you this important political and cultural change. Here in red you have represented the trend in the 80s. So the Saudi cultural influence all over the region inside the GCC, and after the delegitimation of the GCC by the invasion of Kuwait, this new movement, this new dynamic from coastal Emirates towards Western countries. And it started in Qatar. And why in Qatar? Because Qatar was the country that lost, that was the first, Qatar was the place along the coast where the Saudi influence was the most efficient in the 80s, because Qatar is a Wahhabi place, and a lot of common tribes are living in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia, and the ruling family in Qatar is the most divided all over the Gulf. So it's the country where Saudi, the Saudi leadership has been able to create the strongest networks as soon as the 50s. So to distance itself, it's logical to have Qatar as the birthplace for this new relation to museums, to media, intended that it was the place that lost most of its sovereignty in the 80s in exchange of Saudi protection that proved inefficient in 1991. And another important cultural dynamics that is associated to this policy of distancing the coastal states from Saudi Arabia is this one. If you look at what's happening nowadays through the museums and the art markets, or the new cultural developments all over the Gulf, one of the most interesting aspects, and the newest one, is the new cultural links that are expanding through the visibility museums and the art market in the Gulf with Iran. Because if you go to the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, about 50% of the objects exhibited there are from Iran. And it's not hidden at all. They clearly put on the label the provenance of the objects. And if you go to Qatar, the new cultural area in Doha, you will see a huge mosque covered with blue tiles. And when I talked to the people, and a lot of people visiting this area, and a lot of them are nationals, a lot of people were telling me that for them this mosque was a Shia Iranian mosque, but actually it was not. But it was part of the Qatari policy of creating new links with Iran, cultural links with Iran, to balance the Saudi influence in Qatar. And concerning the art market in the UAE, actually it started in Tehran in the 90s. And the birth of an art market in Dubai has to be directly related to the art market in Tehran. And the arrival of Christie's to the region started in the year 2000 under the presidency of Mohammad Khatami in Iran. The new head of the Museum of Contemporary Art of Tehran invited all the directors of Christie's to Tehran in 2000. And his idea was to ask them to organize regional auctions in Tehran. And all the directors came, including Edouard Dolman, who is now working for Qatar at Qatar Museum Authority. They visited a lot of museums. They were introduced to artists, to art collectors, to heads of galleries. And they came back in 2001. And the main problem for them was that in Iran, you can't use the Visa card. But why Christie's came to Iran? Because Christie's idea, in Tehran, the bureaucracy of the Islamic Republic wanted to organize regional art sales of contemporary art. Christie's accepted to come because they thought they will create networks with them and it will make it possible for them to sell the collection of Western contemporary art housed in the storages of the Tehran Contemporary Art Museum. So Christie's came to the Middle East to sell this collection when in Tehran they wanted to create regional art sales for Iranian, Arab, Turkish and Pakistani art. It proved impossible because in Iran they did not want to sell the collection assembled by the Shah, and Christie's thought it not possible to create art sales without Visa card. At that time they contacted an Iranian businessman based in Dubai, an Iranian importer of medicines, who is working with Iran. His main market is Iran. He's an importer of medicine from the rest of the world for the Iranian market. They contacted him because he's an art collector of Islamic art, and they knew him. And he told them, no, it's not absurd at all. Come to Dubai. And I will buy enough works from the first auction sale so that you will cover your costs. So Christie's decided to open a bureau, an office in Dubai in 2005 with the guarantee of an Iranian businessman included in the economic networks of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they did their first sale and it proved very successful, and the Iranian businessman and art collector did not need to support them. And at the same time, between 2005 and 2007, you had two galleries opening in Dubai, and both of them were bringing artworks from Tehran, from Tehran galleries, to sell them to the expatriate community in Dubai. And that's how the network of art galleries, contemporary art gallery, was born in Dubai. You know, by bringing part of the dynamism of the Tehran contemporary art scene to Dubai, to actually to bypass the issue of the embargo. So happened to the Iranian art market what happened to all the other important segments of the Iranian market. So using Dubai as a place to bypass the international embargoes. And why is it important to mention that this strong link between the art market in Dubai, and this art market is still now dominated by Iranian actors, be they artists, galleries, and collectors. And those collectors are not Iranian collectors from the diaspora. The most important one, those who spend a lot of money, are all people who are making their money, have made their money after the Iranian Revolution, and who are well integrated in the post-revolutionary Iran. And so, why do we have this connection possible, those two connections possible at the same time? Connecting the Gulf countries to the West, and at the same time connecting them to the Islamic Republic of Iran. It could look very strange to have at the same time those connections, new cultural connection, instead of this one. Because the new art market in Tehran started expanding after the death of Khomeini in 1989, And it was part of a counter-cultural revolution led by the new president of Iran, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. Why? Because when the revolution happened in Iran, you had two Islamist important branches among the revolutionaries. You had a leftist Islamist group, much influenced by Marxism, and those people decided in 1980 to launch in Iran a cultural revolution, which should have consisted in destroying a lot of palaces, closing museums, and some of them wanted even to sell archaeological sites. The other important group among the Islamists that led the revolution were actually a sort of a conservative right Islamist wing. And their leader were the people from the bazaar, so the merchants mainly, and also the important Ayatollah. Because those two groups were landowners and they wanted to protect private property in front of those revolutionaries who were against private property. Khomeini sided with the leftist Islamists because he knew that the opposition from the merchants, the people from the bazaar, and also the important ulama, the important Ayatollah, was threatening his power. So he sided with the leftists, paradoxically the people influenced by Marxism, and the proponents of a cultural revolution, and he protected them. But when he died, the others took over, so those who were in favor of the protection of private property. Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani became the new president, and Khatami actually is also part of this branch of the Islamist revolutionaries. And those people, one of the most important decisions they took after 1989 was to put an end to the cultural revolution. And the most important decision was to spread all over Iran new universities, having as a model the University of Tehran opened in the 20s, a very nationalist university with a faculty of fine art. So they created semi-public universities all over Iran, to counter the power of the leftists, who wanted to mix the university with the Islamic the Islamic schools from Qom and Mashhad. So they failed, and the proponents of a counter-cultural revolution succeeded, and they created faculties of fine arts all over Iran. Intended that the model was the University of Tehran. And you had a huge increase of the number of art students in Iran in the 90s. In the 90s, they decided, as part of their policies, to deal with this youth, how to control them, and to make the Islamic Republic survive in front of this youth. They decided to create in Tehran an art market for the art students, so that it will provide them with commercial opportunities. And that's how an art market was born in Tehran, and then translated to 10 years later to Dubai. Why I mention that? Because if you look at the new cultural projects in the museum project in Qatar, in Abu Dhabi, they are actually expanding Western conception of culture. And it's not contradictory with importing the art market from Tehran after the death of Khomeini, in the realm of a counter-cultural revolution taking place in Iran. Inside the system, this counter-cultural revolution is led by revolutionary Islamists, but opposed to the Marxist vision. And those people are actually also expanding in Iran the Western cultural models by diffusing all over the country the model of the University of Tehran with faculties of fine arts. So it's not contradictory to have those those two dynamics together, as opposed to this one. Because Saudi Arabia, and I finish with this image, is probably nowadays the only real global cultural power apart from the United States. The only place where you can nowadays find a real alternative to the European or Western definition of culture is nowadays Saudi Arabia. And I just show you this image of Mecca here with the Mecca clock tower. When everybody is focusing on the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and the new museums in Qatar, actually the most important cultural project in the Arabian Peninsula is this one. Because this one is defining culture in another way. In Abu Dhabi and in Qatar, you have an extension of the Western definition of culture, which is centered on arts. This definition of culture is centered on religion. And here you see clearly another model rising. And another interesting element is you see that this clock tower is not trying to create an Islamic contemporary architecture. When Jean Nouvel is trying to create a dome because he says this dome is the most emblematic element of Arabic architecture and he uses Mashrabiya. No, here it's a copy of Big Ben. No, but it's important because in the global area, power comes from copying much more than innovation. Trying to create an Arab modernity, an Indian modernity, an Iranian modernity, it's what a lot of developing countries did in the 60s and in the 70s. And it did not make them powerful. What makes China powerful nowadays is its ability to copy the West. And what makes Saudi Arabia powerful nowadays is also its ability to copy, to a certain extent, Western systems, but with an Islamic perspective. Because the objective of this tower, which is a hotel, is also to change, to give an alternative to the meridian of Greenwich. So this is the Mecca clock tower as opposed to the Greenwich hour. Voilà. Thank you.
Dr. Kazironi, thank you a lot for this interesting lecture. I just want to add something. I attend the Diwani of Sheikh Khaz'al. Sheikh Khaz'al, the museum, it was his diwan, not his palace. And when we was kids, we was visiting the museum. It was 3 floors. In the basement, it was the sea life. And the first floor and second floor, it was all models about heritage. And in the garden, there was an art gallery where we exhibit our work. And my first art exhibition was in this gallery. And the biggest mistake which was made by Ministry of not culture, Wazarat al-Anba wal-Irshad, information. At that time when the museum moved to the new building, Sheikh, no, not Jabir al-Ali, he owned the building, he bought it from the children of Sheikh Khaz'al, his family, Sheikh Abdullah Mubarak, yes. And when they moved from the Diwaniya, he rented this place to the bachelors, workers. And they didn't take care of it, and by the time it's fallen apart. This was the biggest mistake, to lose a nice building like this Diwaniya.
Concerning this first museum in Kuwait, what you said is very important, the fact that there was an art gallery. Because the first museum in Kuwait is not actually part of the real heritage model that was born in Bahrain in 1970. Because the heritage model in Bahrain intended to reduce the power of the Americans in Bahrain and to make the ruling family stronger in front of the other components of the national community. And that's also why they brought British experts, because Bahrain was the main place for cultural clubs in the Gulf. And cultural clubs that were called in Arabic al-Andiya al-Thaqafiyya were the most important places in Bahrain, but also in Kuwait, for political mobilization. They were created by Americans at the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of them in the 1920s. And we had them in Bahrain, we had some in Dubai, and in Kuwait. And they were the places where the Arab nationalist press, the anti-British Arab press, was put at the disposal of the young people coming out of the first modern schools. And in the 50s and the 60s, when the British decided to leave, they tried to consolidate the power of the ruling families. And so at that period, the decision was taken to also close a lot of cultural clubs, particularly in Bahrain, because it was in Bahrain that the cultural clubs were playing such an important political role. And the disappearance of the cultural clubs has to be connected to the rise of the first museum. The first heritage museum in Bahrain came at the same moment when the cultural clubs were closed, and the heads of the most politicized one were sent into exile. And Michael Rice was brought to Bahrain at that moment to change the image of the ruling family in the Western press. So it was really part of political context. And in Kuwait, we do not have that, because we don't have this marginalization of the Americans. Those who opened the first schools are those who opened the first cultural clubs, and they are also those who opened the first museum. And they are also those who entered, who led the National Council till the 80s. That's what really makes Kuwait different from Qatar and the UAE in terms of cultural policies. And that explains why in this first museum you had heritage, but you also had something else. You had modern contemporary art from the country, and that also explains why you have this education and natural history museum opened as soon as the beginning of the 70s here. Because the objective here was not to replace the Arab high culture spread by the cultural clubs by a localized folkloric Arab definition of being an Arab. Because the objective of the museum, the Heritage Museum, was not here to marginalize the Americans. And in that point, I do not follow Gilles Cristal, who is one of the authorities about sociology of the Gulf countries, and she did a lot of studies in Kuwait, because when I look at the history of institutionalizing culture all over the Gulf, the main difference between Kuwait and Qatar and the UAE and Bahrain is that here the same actors started with the modern schools and developed much later the cultural bureaucracies. And my hypothesis is this one. When one compared the Americans all over the Gulf, Kuwait is the only place where a lot of very important Americans are asyl. They are belonging to very important Arab tribes, and it was much more difficult for the ruling families to marginalize them, when it was easier in Qatar or the UAE, because a lot of important American families in Dubai or in the UAE or in Qatar were actually coming from outside. So they did not have the strength to resist the group that suddenly became so powerful because of oil money. And that's what makes the cultural bureaucracy also different in Kuwait and so strong. And that's probably the reason why we don't have a lot of those new projects here. Because here, the decisions are not taken only by the ruling family. The national bureaucracy is very strong in Kuwait, particularly in the cultural field. And decision has to be shared, and that's why also decision making is slower than in the UAE and in Qatar.
Yes, okay. First, thank you for the lecture, okay. And I was expecting more about Kuwait, okay, and especially the National Museum of Kuwait. And since this has been raised, first the palace or Diwan Khaz'al that was dedicated to be the first national museum, and then the National Museum, or actually the Homeland Museum that was which is in the current place. Unfortunately, in Kuwait, which is something that should be studied, Since the start of the design of the National Museum, which was designed by Ekoshar, as you mentioned, it was somehow put on a hold. It wasn't allowed to have, in Kuwait, we are not somehow allowed to have a national museum. A national museum here, what I mean is a homeland museum. This is the thing from the beginning. The main design was established in 1958, and in 1960, all the designs, I'm sure you have did your research, and you know that 60s to 62, all the designs were done. And the whole idea was to have a museum on the idea of a mafruka, Char Ali, okay, which is an Islamic theme with a nice whole thing. The motifs were good, but from day one, the whole thing was delayed, until 1982, when it started to establish, and then they had it finished in 1984. Nothing happened. Half of it were somehow desertified from day one, and the other half was somehow loaned to Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyya. Okay, and this is the thing. After the invasion, the same thing. We have a desertified museum. We don't have a museum, and this is how our cultural identity is somehow attacked here. We are not allowed to have a national museum. This is a problem. This is a problem, and Kuwait is somehow is different than what you said about what's happening in the Emirates and in Qatar. In Qatar and the Emirates, it's like buying a nice Rolls Royce and putting it here. Here, it's a different thing. It's an identity. It's a self-identity, a human identity. My question. Okay, my question is, what do you think about what I said? Thank you.
You're trying to say that Kuwait is different from the other states, but it started the wave with bringing Ekoshar very soon, and is a pioneering country for cultural policy. But what you say is that you don't take into account also the last developments of the museum park. For example, the opening of a heritage museum inside the National Museum after the invasion is quite a meaningful event also, because it was planned to have a heritage section in that part of the museum, a maritime section, but it never opened in the 80s. The aquarium, yes. So after 1991, a heritage museum was opened inside the National Museum, and other museum was also opened outside. I'm thinking of القرين Museum, devoted to the memory of the liberation. And when one look at those two projects, the القرين Museum and the new heritage section of the National Museum, one can see the strength of the national bureaucracy in Kuwait and their ability to represent, to give the possibility for the national community to represent itself in public spaces. For example, if you go to القرين Museum, you will see pictures of nationals who fought for liberating the country with their names. And this is something very rare all over the Gulf, where you only have pictures of the leadership. So the last developments of in the museums in Kuwait is very meaningful of political changes that happened here. You know, you have, I think one should relate those two new projects to the reopening of the parliament after the Gulf War also.
It seems to me that the very core element of your thesis is that there is a paradigm shift in terms of museum function. You very interestingly talked to us about the transition from the heritage paradigm into the visibility paradigm. But it seems to me that somewhere in between we've lost a very important function for these museums, which is the pedagogical function, amidst all this political backdrop, where do we still have a pedagogical, a teaching function for the museum? Thank you.
Yes, the Heritage Museum have not disappeared, even in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi. What I'm saying is that we now have two models, and the only place where you have the second model expanding is are Abu Dhabi and Qatar. But even in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi, you still have a development of the Heritage Museum's model to talk to the population. For example, in Abu Dhabi, the Maritime Museum by Tadarondo will probably never open. But in 2009, they opened a maritime museum that is a heritage museum with targeting a local audience. And if you look at the people who visit this museum, they are mainly nationals. They come, the schools come to visit these maritime museums, and targeting a family audience. So the educational dimension of the museum has not disappeared. It's very important in the heritage museums. And in Abu Dhabi and in Qatar, this function is led to the heritage museums that exist or those who are being created. Because the heritage museums is not a dead model in Abu Dhabi and Qatar. In Qatar and Abu Dhabi, you have now two cultural scenes. You have two types of museums that coexist. One is created to mirror Western points of views on isolated pieces of land located on an island far from the places where the population live. But where you have the national population, you have a lot of cultural events, cultural projects that are following the path that started with the Heritage Museum and the folklore. So the most important thing is to see that in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi, the two despite being contradictory, the two models do coexist. And they can coexist despite their contradiction because the national population is isolated from the platforms where the foreigners are greeted. And you see very few nationals actually attending the opening of the exhibitions in Qatar or in Abu Dhabi. And even the art fairs in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but much less in Dubai, are mainly platforms for Westerners.
Dr. Kazaroni, I just want to, something came up to my mind while sitting there because I'm not sure what you are for. Are you for the heritage museums or for visibility museums, or you are none of these, or you are, I mean, to me, what is the concept? What is your ideal situation? What do you prefer for any country to have a museum? Which kind of museum? Because you are putting us in an area where I know the political aspect of it, but the effect on the society or the effect of the image of the country, which direction should we go?
It depends on your objectives. The visibility museums are too often perceived as neo-Orientalist, neo-colonial project, but actually it's not the case at all. Those museums really managed to make Qatar and Abu Dhabi stronger because they made it possible for the leadership to diversify their networks in the West, in the countries that are able to protect them and to protect the regime also from inside. If your objective, if your preoccupation is the strength of a Gulf country, for sure the Visibility Museum is an efficient tool. But concerning political participation, concerning political participation, political liberalization, for sure the Heritage Museum is a much more efficient system. Because when you bring inside the project nationals, it gives them power in front of the state, in front of the leadership. And what we have seen with those dummies representing the diversity of the population and modifying what the British expert developed 10 years before, it shows you that the museum is a place where a balance of power can erase between the leadership and the rest of the population. And in many Gulf countries, it's not the case in Kuwait, but in the other Gulf countries, you don't have parliamentary life. So in the absence of parliamentary life, the role of the bureaucracy is very important, because being a bureaucrat in Qatar, in the UAE, and even in Bahrain is finally the only way to participate politically, because finally you shape public policies. But when you have, when you look at those new visibility projects, they exclude from this political participation the nationals. So it decreases their political power in front of the leadership. So it really depends on what are your preoccupation, the strength and the defense of the state in front of the rest of the world, or political liberalization. For political liberalization, for sure, when you include the bureaucracy, it's better.
Now, again, thank you very much, Dr. Kazaruni. Thank you for this.
Thank you.